Welcome everyone to today's webinar, um, Accessibility by Design, Tools, Tips, and Best Practices. I'm Kayla Zayas-Ruiz. I'm the Program Director for the Sunshine State Digital Network at Florida State University. My co-presenter is Jennifer Nicholson, the Continuing Education and Leadership Program Administrator at the Florida Department of State in the Division of Library and Information Services. And just a few housekeeping items for today. Today's session is being recorded, so you will get a recording link sent to you as well as a link to the slides. So you'll have access to all of the links and everything that we share with you today. You'll also get a survey asking you some questions about the session and an opportunity to provide us with feedback on additional training topics that you would like covered. So please fill that out so that we can offer training that you're interested in and need more information on. I've also enabled closed captions, so you can feel free to display those captions by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Please keep in mind that these captions are auto-generated, so there may be some errors, but otherwise, those are all the housekeeping items. If you have any questions, you can place those in the chat box at any time, and we'll either answer them at the time, or if it's coming up later in the presentation, we'll address them then. So a little bit about me. I'm the program director for SSDN, and SSDN is a collaborative network of libraries, archives, and museums building capacity to make cultural heritage collections more discoverable and accessible from the state of Florida. I'm really passionate about archives, digital libraries, and creating better access to unique collections.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Nicholson. I'm going to put my email and phone in the chat as well, so that you all guys can contact me if you'd like. So I previously worked as the Florida Statewide Digital Initiative Consultant here at the division, but I recently just moved into the position of Continuing Education and Leadership Program Administrator. So I help with coordinating continuing education for librarians across the state of Florida. At the Division of Library and Information Services, you may have heard of us. We have things such as the State Library, which you can access resources from if you are in Florida. But we also have what's called the Bureau of Library Development. And there are staff people such as myself that work to support and strengthen Florida libraries in different capacities. And so that's part of the work I do right now and why I'm coordinating this with Kayla. And also, since I worked on digital initiatives, it's just kind of a natural fit for me. So all of us in the Bureau of Library Development, if we're a consultant or a program administrator, we're responsible for a certain program area. And a lot of our program areas include web pages and web content that has to meet accessibility purposes. So WCAG 2.1 level AA, which will be the new law that Kayla I know is going to go over a little bit. So again, I'm not an expert in accessibility, but I'm definitely learning and having to apply knowledge to make sure that everybody and all of our citizens in Florida can access this important governmental information. So that's a little bit about me.
So some of the learning objectives that I'm going to cover today are best practices for creating accessible social media content, creating accessible forms, and working with vendors on accessible vendor systems, because that is also going to be part of the requirements of this new law, is that vendor systems that we contract with also have to be compliant. And then these are the learning objectives that Jennifer is going to be covering.
Yeah, so I'm going to discuss a little bit some of the practices and tips concerning AV webinar transcription. There's a process here at the Bureau of Library Development that we've gone through recently to help make sure our YouTube videos are accessible. So I'm going to walk through kind of an example of what we did. There are also just generally some free web content accessibility tools that I kind of use daily that I found work for me in my workflows. So I just wanted to share those with you and demonstrate them. And then also how I look for some of those accessibility errors and remediate them. Again, we've kind of put this disclaimer here that they're provided for informational purposes. We're not saying you have to use any of these tools, but we're saying this is available to you that you may want to consider and what fits best for your organization.
Okay, so getting into some of the content here. So there's good news. In the promotion for this webinar, we said that the deadline has passed, but that is no longer true. So we now have uh, we now have more time. So they've extended the deadline an additional year. So the new deadline for large entities is going to be April 26, 2027, and for smaller entities, April 26, 2028. So we have a little bit more time now to comply with some of these rules. What's covered? The rule applies to most web content and mobile apps offered by public entities, including third-party content. So again, those vendor services as well. Our continued obligations. So while this is a timeline extension, not a waiver of existing ADA requirements, to provide accessible service. So you don't want to stop planning and remediating. And avoid last minute and costly fixes. So we want to continue on focusing on creating a sustainable long-term digital accessibility program for all of our organizations. So this extension is just that. It's giving us more time to implement some of those big picture fixes that are part of this law. So some quick review from last time. What is ADA Title II? It's requirement for accessible public spaces. So ADA Title II covers more than just websites. It's an entire law related to public spaces in general. So this law's been around since I believe the 80s. So a good amount of time. It's just further cementing and implementing these regulations for online spaces, as online spaces are now considered public infrastructure the same way that public buildings have been considered infrastructure over this time. So basically anything that someone can do on your website, like apply for a library card, pay for fees, sign up for classes, all of that needs to be ADA accessible. And it has to be equal access rather than parallel access. So it can't be a please call us instead. It has to be accessible to someone the same way it would be to anyone else. And it can be considered a denial of service without this kind of compliance. So you should have an accessibility policy, conduct a baseline audit, prioritize high impact workflows, keep documentation, and keep your leadership informed on the changes and workflows that you're implementing. You don't need to fix everything at once. You want to focus on high impact workflows first, template level fixes next, and then cosmetic issues later. This is not going to be a one-time project. One-time projects fall by the wayside. Accessibility is now infrastructure. This is civil rights compliance, which is why it's an order through the Department of Justice, because this is a civil rights issue. So you want to make sure that you're taking this seriously and that this is something that you're incorporating as part of your daily work and not as one-off projects. Think of accessibility as part of your new workflow. You also want to assess your organization's risk tolerance and consult legal counsel when in doubt about what needs to comply with this law and what changes should be prioritized. But don't panic. You want to assess, and having that documentation and plan and policy produces clarity, and clarity reduces risk. So having all of that is really going to be important. Okay, so first we're going to talk about social media. So your social media sites are considered an extension of your online presence, especially as a lot of libraries and departments share a lot of pertinent information about events and outreach and services in their online social media accounts. This is why this is considered an extension of your online presence. So all of your social media posts also need to comply with the accessibility rules. So this is going to apply to any new content. It's not retroactive. You don't have to go back through your entire social media feed and make every single one of your social media posts that you've posted in the past accessible. But these are things that you want to implement from one point forward. So once you start adding these features, you want to continue doing that, uh, especially after the deadline. But you don't need to go back and delete everything. You don't need to go back and change everything. It's not retroactive, but you want to keep these things in mind going forward. So first, let's talk about images. So all of your images should have alternative text or alt text added to them. You can add alt text for images on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and I am going to call it Twitter. Um, if image descriptions are automatically generated, make sure to review and modify the descriptions to capture the appropriate meaning and context. If you're including alternative text in the field provided by the social media platform, it's redundant to also include it within the post, as people using screen readers will then have to hear it twice. So you want to make sure that you avoid redundancy, and also make sure that you're reviewing the text for accuracy if you're using anything to automatically generate that text. And then when placing text on a colored background, make sure that the text is accessible by using a contrast checker. And I've linked one here. Again, you'll have access to these links after the webinar. And then for infographics, these are considered images. So you want to make sure that colors are also well contrasted so that they're easy to decipher for people who are colorblind or have visual impairments. And should also include alt text because, again, someone with a screen reader is not going to be able to get the information in the infographic or poster without that alt text. So it will just read image to that person, and they will not get any of that good information that you've worked so hard to include in that infographic. And Jennifer will talk more about how to develop good alt text a little bit later. Same with a lot of this video transcription information. She's going to go into more detail about that too. So all videos that you post on social media should have captions of the audio for the benefit of those without hearing, who are hard of hearing, and who are non-native speakers. Captions can be either closed captions, where a user can turn them on and off, or open captions, where the text is embedded in the video and cannot be turned on and off. Text on screen should also be accessible. So again, you want to make sure that the colors are in good contrast with each other, and make sure that the foreground and background colors have enough of that contrast. So a good way to do that, and Jennifer might talk a little bit more about this too, especially in videos, the colors change a lot in the background, is having text with another color around the border of the text so that it will appear regardless of what the background color is. Additionally, videos and other media should not automatically play on default when somebody opens a page or opens a post. This type of content can be a barrier for those with cognitive impairments, photosensitive epilepsy, ADHD, and other conditions. Users should have the ability to pause videos and other media. If media plays by default and this feature cannot be turned off, users should be made aware of this. So you should have some sort of disclaimer that says this video will automatically play in a new window or something like that. And again, Jennifer is going to provide some more details on that. Additionally, there are going to be some requirements to around audio for what's happening on the screen. So the audio descriptions of video. So That's also something to consider if it's more than just somebody presenting something, if it's like an activity or a film of some kind, you're gonna also have to provide some of that audio um, transcription, not transcription, the audio that reads aloud what's happening on the screen, which I can't think of the name of right now. Um, okay, GIFs. So I know a lot of times we're not really using GIFs in our posts much anymore, but they can happen in comments and things like that. GIFs are not always available to use on all platforms, and not all platforms have a way to add alt text to GIFs. If a platform doesn't allow for alt text on GIFs, the content may be difficult for individuals who rely on screen readers to perceive. Twitter does not allow for alt text on both images and GIFs. So if you have more than one type of media in your post, it might limit the accessibility of one or the other. And you do not want to rely solely on animated GIF content on a social media post. When using animated GIFs, confirm that the post can be understood through its text content alone. You can also consider adding a brief description in brackets at the end of a post to account for this issue. So you can do this for images too, if you want to add a description for an image, if what's in your caption doesn't cover what's happening in the image. So you want to treat GIFs the same way you would treat images and videos, because it's a combo of both. Okay, and finally, text. So creating accessible social media posts text. So when you're using hashtags, you want to use what is known as camel case. This is where the first letter of each word is capitalized in a hashtag. So there's an example here on the screen, hashtag reading in summer. This formatting means that people using screen readers will hear the words individually rather than as a long, incoherent word, as is likely to be the case if no letters are capitalized. And this is also just easier for people in general to read, rather than if that were in all lowercase, it would be a lot harder to decipher that it says reading in summer than with the camel case. Emojis and emoticons. So screen readers will read emojis as their description. So an example, if you're using the clapping hands emoji, it will say clapping hands. Because of this, it can be confusing if emojis are placed between words. Do not overuse emojis in social media posts, and place a space between each one. And also think about the context of the emoji and if it will make sense when it's read aloud to somebody. Emoticons or representations of expression created through a variety of keystrokes, like a colon and a closed parentheses to create a smiley face, will be read as semicolon parentheses and should be used sparingly, if at all. And then finally, for hyperlinks, you want to keep URLs short whenever possible because screen readers will read them out to users, just as if they were words strung together in a long hashtag. There are many tools available that offer a free and easy way to shorten your URLs, or you can embed a URL in text as well. And then finally, for plain language, you want to avoid using acronyms and make sure that the meaning of your social media posts are clear. Okay, moving on to forms. So as I mentioned before, you're going to have to be able to provide any service that somebody can use online has to be accessible. So a lot of things that we have online include applications for things or registration forms and things like that. So this is going to be really important to keep in mind when you're developing those workflows and processes for people to be able to sign up for things. So when creating digital forms or surveys, there are a few considerations to ensure you maintain accessibility for all of your users. Several online survey platforms, including Qualtrics, Google Forms, and Microsoft Forms, have accessibility features built in and make it easy to create and maintain forms as well as gather data. They're also user-friendly and mobile-friendly and mobile responsive. Document-based forms, so forms you create in Word or in PDFs, are more difficult to make accessible and gather data systematically. In many cases, document forms can be moved to an online platform for efficiency and accessibility. So when creating forms, you want to use a layout or theme with an accessible level of color contrast, avoid animated backgrounds or auto-playing music, add a form title to display in the browser tab, consider adding a progress bar for longer surveys and or numbering your questions. And when creating PDF forms, they may be made more accessible, but are more complex to create than other digital form types. We would encourage, if possible, using one of those other web form services like Qualtrics, Google, or Microsoft Forms instead, as online forms are easier to fill out for all users, easier to make accessible, and easier to gather data from for survey owners. And then if you are custom building your forms via HTML, there are also a few considerations to keep in mind for accessibility. So use semantic HTML. So using four buttons, provide accessible labels and instructions on your HTML forms. You want to clearly mark your required fields and then use the field set to group related questions. And then you also want to provide helpful error messages and verify that error messages are announced by screen readers. Ensure color choices have accessible levels of contrast. And then again, for HTML forms, you want to consider adding a progress bar for longer surveys. I added in some resources here as well for creating accessible forms. Qualtrics actually has several pages related to this, but they have a base page related to all of their accessible question types. Adobe WebAIM has a page on creating accessible Adobe forms, and then the W3 organization has tutorials on creating accessible forms as well. So those are three really good resources to look into. Okay, and finally, vendor system accessibility. So assessing vendors for accessibility involves a 5-step process. You want to require VPATs and ACRs. A VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, and ACR stands for Accessibility Conformance Reports. So you want to require those in your contracts, and then you want to validate these reports. You want to test products directly using tools like Wave extension, confirm remediation plans for issues, and then monitor compliance over time. Key steps include setting clear WCAG 2.2 AA standards, demanding evidence of expertise, and evaluating product compatibility with assistive technology. So this is going to require a little bit more work on our part because we are going to have to verify and conduct our own testing. You cannot solely rely on the VPAT or the ACR for compliance. Because again, you're providing that service through the vendor, so you're liable for that. They may also be liable, but you are also liable for that. So you have to do that testing as well to make sure that it is meeting that compliance. And you want to make sure that you're asking targeted questions to vendors about their accessibility compliance. So you want to query vendors on their internal expertise, accessibility testing methods, and processes for handling reported issues. And in conducting that testing, you're gonna you want to perform manual keyboard testing. You want to do the automated checks with screen readers with that wave testing tool, and then confirm that the claims that the vendor is making about their accessibility are actually true. Um, and then review their remediation plans. So if issues are found, confirm that the vendor has a specific roadmap and timeline for improvements. Again, this is where that documentation is really going to help you. You want to demonstrate that you're working towards that compliance and that it's not just something that's sitting there. So having that documentation, understanding that roadmap is going to be really important, and it has to be a really big part of your selection and negotiation process with your vendors as well. Common pitfalls to avoid when looking at vendor system accessibility are accepting that we're working on it without specific documentation or remediation roadmap. Relying on automated testing, which only catches about half of accessibility issues. Failing to check if the vendor has knowledgeable staff or partners dedicated to accessibility. And then I've added some additional resources on here as well. Section 508 has guidance on understanding vendor claims. The Wave extension that I talk about that allows you to evaluate web accessibility. And then the last resource on here is specific to Harvard University, but it has a lot of really good tips on and a checklist for selecting vendors based on accessibility. It does go somewhat into their own procurement process, but you can ignore that part and just take the really good tips that are on that page otherwise. But that's also a really good resource just to kind of understand what some of those standards that you're looking for should be and what they look like. Does anyone have questions? Okay. Well, I'm going to hand control over to Jennifer, and she's going to tell us more about video transcription.
Okay, let's make sure I can go forward. There we go. Hooray. So, hi again, everybody. I'm Jennifer Nicholson. So I'm going to chat a little bit about first our video transcript process management project. It's a phased approach to our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel right now is where we are putting a lot of our continuing education, our recording of webinars, a lot of different things. So I wanted to share our process for this. This process was started by the former continuing education team led by Dr. Vanessa Gray, and now it's continuing under me as the head of continuing education. This is just one way we chose to handle ensuring that our videos were compliant, but I wanted to talk about our process a little bit because I find from my own learning that sometimes just giving a practical example helps get me started on a process that can seem really long and daunting. So first, I wanted to talk about the compliance focus areas. What was our ultimate goal in doing this process at all? So according to Section 508, which is for accessibility for minimum ADA compliance, video and audio content should include transcripts that provide equivalent information. So these transcripts should be synchronized with the audio, use accurate spelling and grammar, and be easily readable. They should also identify speakers and non-speech sounds. So we realized that we needed to be doing that with our videos. And so we needed accurate captions that were not auto-generated only. We needed to ensure all current and future videos on the Bureau of Library Development's YouTube channel were ADA compliant by providing those accurate time-synced closed captioning of transcripts. We also needed to archive any legacy content that we had and ensure ADA compliance for all of the retained videos that we kept. And we also needed those through accurate closed captioning of transcripts. We also wanted standard transcripts available into the YouTube description area. So by standardizing this process by providing a link to a PDF in the description makes it a lot easier for somebody to access the transcript. And then when they come to our YouTube channel, they can also know that the transcript will be available in that description for them. And then, of course, we also wanted accessibility for individuals with hearing and visual impairments. We obviously want to ensure that all of our citizens can access our content and benefit from the trainings that we've put online. And let's see if it'll go ahead for me. Oop, went too fast. Okay, so this is kind of a breakdown of what we determined was our four-phased approach, and we're actually still working through this approach. I know I see Nicole, who's online, who's helped a lot with the actual transcription process of these videos. So just a little shout out to Nicole. The first phase was really planning and the tool selection. So we identified, that YouTube was going to be our main source for video content and editing. So we looked at what type of subtitle process was available, looked at, what Kayla had talked about earlier in the video about making sure that any of the captions that are on there, the text is in white, the background's kind of in a black, so that if it pops up on the video, people will be able to read it, even though the background color might be different. The audio transcript and the caption conversion workflow created. So YouTube does do those closed captionings, but they're not always accurate. Kind of like how AI maybe it isn't necessarily always accurate. You need to double check what those captions said. And then when you put it into a transcript, you need to make sure that you're kind of cleaning up that transcription process before you actually post the PDF, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But we kind of looked at that different workflow. We looked at different staff that would be able to assist with that. Different people had different roles, such as supervisor level being kind of checking on the process at the very end, making sure everything looked clean and good. And then some of our administrative staff helping with the actual listening. So phase two was, of course, we have all of these things uploaded onto our YouTube channel, but we're still making new content. We're still making videos. So how are we going to prioritize these older videos versus these newer videos? Well, we determined that anything that we upload from that point forward, which was about we started this around June 2025. I want to say, of course, there was planning a lot more before that, but we started planning around then that from that point on, anything with the new upload would have to follow this process. So it really helped by just starting it right then, even though all of the old stuff had not had everything transcribed yet, because it gave you a point to where you knew, and then it was just a little bit easier to start that process. Phase three was retrofitting any existing videos. So we looked at all of the videos on our YouTube channel, and we really determined, and of course, according to records management retention that's required as well. If you're not as familiar with that, we do have a program here at the division that can help you with that if you're a government entity. But we had to look at what videos we really needed to keep, what was the most high priority to make sure that they were published. And we made sure to review and transcribe and caption those first. So anything that was kind of older, maybe didn't have a lot of views, wasn't essential to the program area. Some examples might include if there was a video that you've done or a webinar you've done on a certain topic, and then you did that same topic 10 years ago. Well, you probably want to choose the video that you just recently did that's going to have the most recent information to get online. If you want to make sure to continue to have that past the ADA deadline, then the one from 10 years ago up and ready to go. But it's still retained within our records for that records retention. And then phase four is the audit and maintenance. So annual audit and staff training, which will probably be coming up for us since, again, we implemented this in June. So just a nice refresher for staff on, hey, remember, we're continuing to do this transcript, this closed captioning. Keep this in mind for all these different program areas as you're making different videos and things like that. So it has been a phased approach. It's continuing to be a phased approach. Here at the division, we actually have a communications process that everything has to kind of be looked through. So again, for us, it was very important that those high priority videos were reviewed first so we can get them online. And so as they've been going through our communications process, we're continuing to put more and more things on YouTube. For technical purposes, we maybe unlisted some things so that we could work on the transcript because we didn't want anything that, wasn't accessible for people online. And so kind of coordinating that approach, we created a very nice curation status on a nice Excel sheet for all of our staff to use, where we either, determined that we could remove the video from YouTube because it's not current and access isn't needed by anybody, and that met the retention records. We either keep it unlisted, so that we can work on transcribing it, and keeping unlisted helps prevent dead links. We kept it private if it's current, but we want to retain it. Publish it if it's current and relevant and we had everything done, or deleting if again, the retention value and we can allow it to be deleted. So that it not only is like helping you with accessibility, it's almost kind of weeding through your videos and things to put a library perspective on it, and is actually will continue to be helpful in the future as we try to build up our videos and webinars. So coordination with staff was really important there. So I wanted to give a little bit of a practical example. Let's see if it'll move on to the next slide for me. There we go. I'm going to put this in the chat, the link to this great example of one of our discussions.
And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Vanessa Gray.
It's playing on my computer.
Thank you.
Oh, it's playing on your computer.
On our September D.
That's okay. I just muted Kayla so she can figure that out. But if you click on that link, which I'd like everybody to do, there's going to be a couple of little bit of interactive activities here. Okay, nobody worry. But if you could click on the link, you can see here a couple different things. As Kayla talked about earlier, we did include hashtags. The first item is always capitalized, again, to make sure that it's reading correctly. And then you'll notice transcript, and then there's a direct link to our PDF transcript. And there's also a screenshot that shows that on here as well. Underneath that, if you take a little more look at the description, we talk about what you learn. There's also timestamps. The timestamps are very helpful for navigating to content. Some of this is great not only for accessibility, but for really all users. It's helping you get to certain areas. And then also we provide information on technical assistance. So if you wanted to look through our transcript, that kind of gives you an idea of how we went through this process and what it looks like. And I'm going to pull up the image. So here's the transcript result. We chose to structure it very clearly every single time. At the very top, we have an image that's just kind of our departmental image. But then we chose to put the title, the date. There's a clear list of who the presenters are. And then you'll notice that any of the speakers are bolded. And then any of the text they said afterwards is right there as well. And then each time a speaker changes, their name is bolded. So that's an example of the transcript result. So a couple of other tips as you go about doing this process. One thing that you should do is remove excess filler words from the transcript. It just makes it clearer for people that are reading the transcript. It's conveying the same type of meaning, but they don't have to kind of stumble through the same things. For instance, if somebody says, "Oh, Kayla, I love your polka dotted shirt, striped shirt." There's not any reason for you to include the polka dotted shirt, right? The person was maybe self-correcting themselves. Or sometimes I struggle with saying a lot during presentations, or other people will. And so in order to make that easier for the person to read on the transcript, there's really not a need to review it. I know for me personally, that was a little hard for me as a librarian because I like to include all the really small technical information, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is to make sure that person has a quality of access. It's also important to describe images aloud if you're live, excluding decorative images. So you'll notice I didn't really talk about, there technically is a logo for the division in the bottom corner of this webinar, but it's not conveying important essential information I haven't already talked about. So there's not a reason to describe that image out loud. However, if I was on a website or webinar or wherever, and there was an image that was, for instance, a map of Florida, and it was conveying something very important to essential to my presentation, I should try to describe that image out loud. Then that way, when somebody's doing the transcript later, they don't have to figure out how do I add in this information? What was this person really trying to describe? It's easiest to do that then. Another thing is to describe sounds in your captions and transcripts. Again, if they're essential to the information. If somebody's laughing, you know, the people would like to know that that was something that was happening in that moment. You can just kind of put in brackets laughs, or if there's a particular sound on a video somebody's playing that's important, making sure to do that. And then also always identifying yourself as the speaker. Sometimes on more interactive webinars, somebody might just pop on and start talking. That's fine, but in the transcript, after the fact, you should always try to track down and see if you can find that person's name and put that in the transcript. It's also just helpful if you come off mute or things like that in a webinar. If you identify yourself, that's why when I came back on, even though, you know, you could probably hear that it was me, not everybody maybe could. So I want to make sure, yes, it's me, it's Jennifer, it's not Kayla anymore. This is the next person. So those are just some small tips, but I find that they make a big difference, and it's also helpful for the transcriber. Nicole, you can always feel free to chime into the chat if you have any tips. Nicole has done a lot of our transcripts, and sometimes you have to make those determinations in the moment too. Sometimes there's, you know, an excessive word filler or some awkward pause, but maybe it is actually helpful. And so you just try your best according to the rules that are given to make sure that it's accessible for everybody. So that is our information about AV and transcription. Now I want to talk a little bit about the alt text generation and give a little bit of demonstration. So first I'm going to give a little bit of a tip. Then I'm going to give us a little activity, which you don't have to come off mute, but you can if you'd like, or you can put it in the chat. And then I'll show how I walked through writing some alt text for the example that I'll show you. So alt text, which Kayla so wonderfully described earlier, gives you the ability to describe an image on the back end so that information can be read for people that might have visual impairments. So if you use a tool, which I'm about to show you an example of one, to generate text, you should always edit and refine that. You should not just straight up copy it from that tool because there's important information that might be missing depending on the context. Also, you don't know if that tool has the same background information that you might need, as well as it might be really long, it might be really short, and you might need to adjust it. It's recommended to keep the description of an alt text 1 to 2 sentences or less than 150 characters about. So you don't want like paragraphs and paragraphs of something to describe an image. Again, I talked about the relevant context. Depending on what the context is on your website, on your webinar, on whatever web page that it's on, you might need to describe the alt text a little bit differently, which we'll show an example of that in a second. It's not a good idea to say image of or picture of, even if maybe it's a picture of my face. Instead, say something like headshot of Jennifer, because then it indicates to the person that it's maybe just my head, or full body shot, something like that. Or even if it's a flyer or something like that, it's just better to explain what's actually happening in the image rather than just saying an image of something else. And again, we talked about decorative. You can always mark images as decorative if they're not being used for understanding the main content. Basically, if that image isn't doing a job, then it can be marked as decorative. So the tool I'm going to show you that I found helpful that Dr. Vanessa Gray actually shared out with us is called Tailwind Alt Text Tool. This tool is actually really mostly used for helping with social media because if your images have alt text, it's actually better for kind of get like social media understanding like how it's related to the different topics and things, which can be very helpful, but it's also very helpful for accessibility. So there's a win-win here with a lot of accessibility things. I find it's very helpful because you can just easily drag and drop your image, and then it usually does a pretty good job generating a couple sentences. So for example, let's get into our activity. How would you describe this image? I'll give everybody a second because I know it's a more complex image, but if anybody either wants to come off the mic or try to type something in the chat, there's not a wrong answer. The point is to try to practice and use these skills.
I'll chime in. They can't unmute themselves. They can only type.
Oh, okay, just kidding. Then type.
Uh, I would say this is a map of Florida with red dots. But I don't know what the red dots show, so I can't. But it's points of interest, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's not bad. Anybody else want to give a try? Well, that's a pretty good attempt at it, Kayla. So I will go ahead to the next slide and show you how I decided to approach this. So first I put it into the Tailwind alt text tool to see what it would say. So the generation that came up was map of Florida with numerous red dots scattered across, showing population or event distribution. Dense clusters are seen in urban areas like Miami and Tampa. So that's pretty good, right? I mean, considering we don't really know the full context of this. There were a couple things though. Again, we talked about how alt text, we should try to keep it under 150 characters. So this was 133, so not too bad. But this did kind of have a longer bit of sentence. And as I write here on the slide, it's a good description, but it doesn't provide all the context for the presentation I was working on. So I'll give a little bit of background. I want this for an online presentation that's going to be posted. And I'm trying to explain to new public library directors all of the different types of library outlets that are across the state. So it could be library branches, basically the location of physical public library buildings are all the red dots. You can kind of think about it that way. But again, that's really long and complicated. So I was inspired by the Tailwind alt text, took that, and then edited it into this. The final result was map of Florida dotted with numerous red markers, so I kept that, primarily along coastlines and urban areas, indicating the data points of library outlets. So for us specifically in the webinar, we're going to be talking about what library outlets are, that you can use this map for data points that we have available that's accessible for people. So therefore, that kind of gave it a little bit of context. But that's just an example of how you can take a tool, just put a little bit of your own spin on it for that important context for the person that's trying to understand the alt text and then input it. So that's how I use Tailwind. So I hope that you find that helpful in whatever your alt text tool of choice. Now we'll get on to heading structures. It'll follow a similar structure where I'll give some tips. We'll do a little bit of activity and then a demonstration. So headings, a lot of documents use headings. For instance, I'm going to give an example of Microsoft Word, but even for instance, Constant Contact that we use here at the division, you can actually input headings as you're building out your email and newsletter listing. It's important to use those headings because screen readers, it helps jump between the different sections of a document. Imagine having to read an entire long document just to get to a certain section or point you want to get to. It's not enough to just bold something. So it's really important to go in order and not skip different heading levels. So you don't want to go from heading 1 to heading 5. You want to make sure that if you need to get to heading 5, then there's headings between that. You should also use only heading 1 once. This can get a little tricky in Microsoft Word because we think, oh, the first level heading for everything, but really the title should be heading 1. Everything else should be kind of heading 2, 3, again, not skipping headings underneath that. Also, you want to check for empty spaces that may create empty headings. Sometimes if you press enter or shift, that can while you're creating a heading, it can actually create an empty space and assumes that that empty space is its own little heading. Then the screen reader will read that. You don't necessarily see it as a visual person on the front end, but then if you look on the back end, which I'll show an example, it can create problems. It's also a good idea to create these headings in Microsoft Word or your other word processing thing of choice before you create a PDF, because it'll be easier for the PDF to kind of identify some of the headings. You can go back and remediate a PDF, but it's just much easier. You should also use different words for different headings. So let's say that, there's a lot of things on a particular topic. You'll notice that, for instance, on my slides, the last slide that I used was called heading structures. This slide is called heading tips. So I can just kind of vary the phrasing a little bit, and then it's very obvious that we are still kind of in that same general area, but we know to skip to different things rather than everything being labeled headings. So that's a little bit of tips there. So here's another example activity that we can walk through. How would you label these as headings? We have Welcome to the Library, then Collections, then Print Books, then we have a variety of books to select from, then Digital Library, then check out our databases, ebooks and audiobooks, then Programs, then Story Times, then we offer toddler story time every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern, then book clubs, then fantasy book club, then science fiction book club. And again, I'm reading everything out loud so that if somebody can't visually see this, they know what's on the screen. But if we were to kind of put this in headings, let's assume that this is a library webpage. What headings would you assign to what wordings? Okay, I see Vic Jones in the chat. So welcome to the library would be heading 1, collections heading 2, print books heading 2. We have a variety of books to select from heading 3, digital library heading 2, heading 3, check out our databases, ebooks and audiobooks. Heading 2, programs, heading 2 for story times, heading 3 for we offer toddler story time every Thursday at 2, heading 2, book clubs, heading 2, fantasy book club, and heading 2, science fiction book club. Nice, yeah. And I see you did not skip headings, right? You went from heading 1 to 3. Then it's okay to go back to 2, but then you went to 3, then 2, then 3, then 2. So good. Yeah, that's a great example. So I'll show what I suggested for the labeled headings. And again, it just depends on your context too for some of this as well, right? So I put Welcome to the Library as heading 1 or just regular heading in Microsoft Word. And then Collections heading 2. And then maybe if you wanted print books to be underneath Collections, you could put it as heading 3. But it depends. Are you wanting to say your collections is everything underneath this? Or are you wanting to think that your print books is separate from some of the collections you're talking about? So Vic Jones, for example, maybe that was your thinking. There's also the option when you do headings, when you label headings, that you don't have to necessarily have some text as a heading, but you want to make sure that you choose paragraph. So for instance, if I didn't want that sentence, we have a variety of books to select from to necessarily be a heading, I just wanted it to be some text on there, but I wanted it to be under print books because I'm talking about the print books, that could be paragraph. No, you're fine, Vic Jones. Yeah, I forgot about paragraph. No worries. But it's a good point. I mean, if you again, just depending on what your context is. For instance, here I put digital library as heading 3 because I'm considering it under collections. But again, if you want that to be separate, then that could be heading 2. Check out our databases, ebooks and audiobooks. I put as paragraph or normal. Programs, I'm assuming that that's a whole other section under Welcome to the Library, so that went back to heading 2. Story times, I'm considering underneath programs, so that's heading 3. We offer toddler story time every Thursday at 2. I put that as paragraph normal. Again, just depending. You can also put that as heading. Book clubs, I put under heading 3 because again, I'm assuming it's under a program. And then I actually went up all the way to heading 4. I went a little crazy with it. So with book clubs, heading being heading 3, fantasy book club is heading 4, and science fiction book club is heading 4. So I think it just shows that uh, depending on how you want the reader to be reading your web page, your website, different things, there's not necessarily, again, as long as you're following kind of some of those tips, there's not a horribly wrong way to do it, as long as it's a logical reading order that's conveying that meaning for the user. So that's an example of headings.
It might be, I think a good way to
Hmm.
too is like think of it like a collapsible menu, right? So
Hmm.
like, how do you want structuring a collapsible menu? Like what do you want to show up in what order? You can think of your headings that way too.
Exactly. And so I'm going to skip us to here because here's an example of Microsoft Word. It does kind of do that when you assign the headings. I wanted it, and you'll see on the left side that kind of collapsible heading with the welcome to the library, and then it indents it with collections, with print books and digital library underneath. So I wanted it to kind of be collapsible like that. And then programs, I wanted story time and book club underneath it. And then fantasy book club and science fiction book club is under book clubs. And so that's all kind of the collapsible. So Word can be really helpful when you're trying to figure out that navigation. And I talked about that spacing issue. So in this screenshot, you'll see that there is an interesting little space under digital library and before you read programs. And you'll notice on the right-hand side where you can actually see the text that the little paragraph thing there is actually showing as the text is like a heading. So this empty space is really, even though you did a hard enter, it's being interpreted as a heading. So when you are assigning those headings like that, and then also under Welcome to the Library, there's again that enter, but really it actually just kind of created another heading. So either make sure to change those to paragraph or normal, or just consider looking at your spacing and how you've done your different entering throughout Microsoft Word to make sure that that's not happening. Because again, they'll read that as a blank space, and then that would be confusing for somebody reading. So, okay, well, that was our example with headings. So thank you all. I know that maybe you weren't expecting as much interaction, but here it is. I think it's helpful for us to, use those muscles, practice those skills. The last thing I want to touch on is WAVE, which is the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. This is a very helpful tool for reviewing websites, but it still needs a manual check. I'm going to go over this pretty fast because I think a lot of us are familiar with it, but also I just like to show screenshots because sometimes we hear about these tools, but we don't necessarily always see them on the backside. So Wave has some really neat functions, but there's a lot of things that it throws at you when you look at the details on it. There are errors, and those are issues that need to be fixed to comply. So that's really the main one you want to focus on the most. There's contrast errors, which identifies color contrast issues. There's alerts that you may need to fix, but may not, depending. There's also features that shows what accessibility items are being used on the page. There's structural, which shows the structure of headings, which we just talked about, the navigation and the search. And then there's ARIA. ARIA is a check on a more complex accessibility tool. I'm not really going to touch on that here, but just know that it is something that you might see that pops up. So at the home page, I decided to try to put in section508.gov, which is one of the accessibility web pages, just to see how it did on Wave. So this is just a screenshot example of the Wave homepage. And then this is the section508.gov homepage. So I want to see how accessible it is and how Wave interprets that. So here's an example of the homepage with Wave. So on the left-hand side, you can see the details page where I just went through and talked about the errors. So it looks like this has no errors, which is great because they should be an accessible website, and we all should get there as well too. You also see that there aren't any contrast errors. So clearly they checked for all that different type of color contrast being used. But there are 6 alerts. One of them says that there's a long alternative text. Again, that's maybe something that could be fixed, could be helpful to make a little shorter, but it's not something that is going to stop you from being compliant. There's also 21 different features being used. Looks like they have a lot of different 29 structures, and then 45 examples of the ARIA. So that's just a quick example of how to kind of look at a wave accessibility tool. Make sure that you're understanding how to maybe look at the different areas. And a lot of times with these tools, I just click on a lot of things until I figure stuff out. I think us as librarians too, it can be helpful to just explore a tool and mess around with it. But if you haven't explored Wave, that's something that right now, again, you can assess where your website and your web page is at and look at it and then make determinations on how to fix it. So I just wanted to end our time because I know it's 4 o'clock. And thank you all so much for attending this webinar. And if you had any tools or tips today that surprised you, was there a tool that you in particular want to try for yourself? And then is there anything that you still want to learn about accessibility? I know us at the division and also Kayla at SSDN, we do a lot of these trainings and stuff to benefit you all and to make sure we're benefiting our citizens here in Florida. So if there is anything, feel free to drop in the chat, or I believe we're also going to have a survey after this that will also, you can also make any comments there. But be thinking about that um, as you continue on your day to day. So some final thoughts is always use any of these tools in accordance with your organization. If in doubt, consult your accessibility expert or your legal counsel. You should always manually check something after using an accessibility tool. And remember that you're helping everyone use a resource. Sometimes it can get very technical, it can get very detailed, but ultimately, I'm very happy doing these tasks because I know that it's going to be able to let somebody else access something that they maybe couldn't before and that they need to be able to access. So that's just some of my final thoughts for you all as we go about our day. So thank you all so much. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and Kayla today and view these resources. And I know, Kayla, you had a couple of additional resources. Did you want to mention that real quick?
Yeah, so that first link is has lots of little short sections on different ways to like tier your accessibility compliance approach to kind of make it a little bit more um, easy to make it feel less overwhelming. The W3 organization, current guidelines, an article on JAWS, which is the screen reader, and how to make sure your web pages are compliant for a screen reader. And then just the general WebAIM website. Uh, the digital accessibility policy that Harvard has, which I think is also just a good example. We're not all Harvard, but they've done some work and they're providing good examples. So it's just an example of what your policy could look like, what different parts of a policy are. And then Section 508 has a web page as well on understanding vendor claims on accessibility. And then just in general, the Section 508 website, which Jennifer has also shared many times during the presentation.
Well, thank you all so much for coming to this webinar today. I know that we are going to be posting the recording of this webinar eventually as well too. So I encourage you to share that if you found this helpful and for the benefit of others. Um, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Vic.